This week on Dialogue, President Obama's spring break in Latin America. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests today are Cynthia Arnson. Cindy is director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program. She's editor of the upcoming book, In the Wake of War, Peace and Democratization in Latin America. Previously, she was a professor at American University and a foreign policy aide for the U.S. House of Representatives. João Augusto de Castro Neves is a political consultant and the founding partner of CAC Consultoria. He appears frequently in Brazilian and international media, including places like the Financial Times, The Economist, and The Washington Post. Paulo Sotero is director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. Previously, he served as Washington correspondent for a leading Brazilian newspaper. His frequent media appearances include work as a commentator and analyst for the BBC. Welcome to the program. Thanks for all joining us today. Cindy, could we begin by imposing on you to give us an overview of the trip? Where's the president headed?
Well, he's headed first to Brazil, and from there goes to Chile and then El Salvador. And I think the selection of countries itself is very interesting. He's going to Brazil, obviously the largest democracy in the Western Hemisphere, the largest economy, a rising global power. Chile is also a mature democracy, a consolidated democracy with a dynamic economy that has been very successful in reducing poverty and inequality. And then Central America, I think, reflects the fact that there's a huge difference between how countries are doing in South America and how countries are doing in Central America. El Salvador is a country that is deeply integrated with the United States, which suffered tremendously as a result of the recession in this country, has high levels of crime and violence affected by narco-trafficking, not only in Mexico, and it's spread through the region, but also long-standing problems of gang violence. A third of Salvadorians live in the United States, and the remittances that they send back are about a fifth of the Salvadoran economy. So, you know, there's a recognition that South America is doing very well, and the United States needs to engage in a constructive way rather than ignore the region. And Central America, I think, is somewhat, you know, distinct in that there is a real crisis there in security terms and in humanitarian terms.
If you were planning this trip for the president, is there another stop that you would add or one that you'd subtract? Was this the list you would have come up with?
I think I would have added Colombia. Colombia has been a historic U.S. ally. The president will probably go there next year for the Summit of the Americas meeting. It's also a bit embarrassing to go to Colombia without having pressed for the passage by the Congress of the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. But there are a lot of things that are happening in Colombia that are expanding on the security gains of the last administration. And Colombia is really changing in very dynamic ways, expanding its foreign policy partners, engaging more and more in the region and outside the region. And, you know, the relationship between Colombia and the United States, I think, has suffered as not only as a result of the failure of the FTA to be approved, but also, I think, by this kind of benign neglect.
Joe, same question. I'd like to get your thoughts on the selection of countries and how you analyze why the White House selected these stops.
Well, first of all, halfway through Obama's first terms, it seems that for the first time he's giving a message to Latin America. So there's a lot of expectations from Latin America's perspective that what does Obama have to offer these countries? Brazil and Chile, obvious choices, of course. If you pick 3 or 4 main countries in Latin America, these two would figure among the top countries. You add maybe Colombia and even Mexico. El Salvador, I think you have to think of the whole region around it. There's a drug problem in the region in Mexico and countries bordering El Salvador. And the United States, the Obama administration has had a few tensions with countries in that region, namely Honduras recently. There's been some tensions with Panama. And so I think in El Salvador, maybe it has a free trade agreement with the United States, Central American Free Trade Agreement. Maybe it's a foothold of United States foreign policy towards Central America. That could be a way to look at it. But I think the fact that halfway through his first term, This is a great opportunity for Obama to tell Latin America and South America and these countries what is his message, what is his agenda to the region. And from a Brazilian perspective, we have a new administration, and a visit by the President of the United States is always a big deal for Brazil. And there's been a lot of expectations. What will Obama offer Brazil? What to expect from Obama's visit to the region? And when it comes to presidential diplomacy, it's important to have in mind that gestures are as important as accords, as deals. If we're talking about a major arms deal or trade deal, I think that's a very remote possibility. But I think that Obama, he could offer Brazil recognition, and that's important. That plays rather well into Brazil's objective of more international prestige, more international leverage. So I think that we have to keep in mind, because he may go to Brazil and leave Brazil without anything concrete to offer, but the gesture will be assimilated, and I think the gestures matter when it comes to presidential diplomacy.
Paulo, Joel mentioned Mexico, and it's not on the hit list or the stop list. I've read some maybe cynical coverage saying this is designed to be a feel-good tour, that not going to a place like Mexico where there are a lot of problems with the U.S. is an intentional choice, and go to countries where, you know, we're getting along pretty well. What do you say in response to that? Do you think that there's an aspect?
The president has been to Mexico. You know, Mexico is the border of the United States. Very intense, very complex relationship. With Brazil, I think there is something that João mentioned that I'd like to insist on, the symbolism. This is the first time that a high-level dialogue between a Brazilian and an American administration starts with the American president going first to Brazil.
Well, add to that the first African-American president and the first woman president of Brazil.
In a moment where Brazil is rising in the global scene in importance, in relevance, to quote from the current U.S. ambassador to Brazil, Brazil is not an emerging country. Brazil has emerged. So the symbolism of the fact that President Obama goes to Brazil at this moment, at the very early stages of President Dilma Rousseff's government, and particularly after a very, very difficult year in Brazil-U.S. relationships due to events that happened in Honduras and in the Iranian nuclear deal, where Brazil and the United States took different positions. It was the most serious crisis in bilateral relations in over 30 years. So I think there is the effort that the two administrations made in order to make this visit possible tells something about the importance that President Obama and President Dilma Rousseff attribute to the bilateral dialogue.
And so you think that's the key factor in the timing of this trip, is these rough spots that we've encountered recently?
Not only that, is that, you know, Brazil and the United States have to learn how to talk to each other, how to deal with each other in a new way. Brazil is not a country where, in this I would disagree a bit with João. I don't think that Brazil is expecting much from the United States. What I think that Brazil expects a sort of engagement with the United States. Brazil will look for areas of cooperation that are meaningful for the two countries. In expectations, Brazil would expect that the United States, for instance, in agricultural trade, that has been a problem, that the United States stops investing money it does not have, public money, in things it does not need, like subsidizing corn for ethanol. Studies that we presented actually at the Wilson Center make clear that the industry is mature and should work in the market. So the United States, we know, faces a very serious fiscal crisis. So here's an opportunity. More deeply, if you read the President Obama's State of the Union address and President Dilma's speeches, there is a very interesting coincidence between what is priority for them in their own countries. Better public spending, better spending of public money, more investments in education, more investments in infrastructure, focus on innovation, because although at different levels, Brazil and the United States have similar problems of gaining international competitiveness. So in a relationship that is really driven by more and more by multinational companies, American multinational companies in Brazil, and Brazilian multinational companies increasingly in the United States, I think this is there is a common platform for dialogue, for concrete progress on issues that matter for the two countries.
I was going to say, I mean, it would really be inconceivable for President Obama to go to South America and not go to Brazil. It's about 40% of regional GDP. It's not only the dominant regional player, but also increasingly a global player.
8th largest economy in the world, is that correct?
8th largest economy, which now looks like 5th.
7th. It's
Seventh since this week.
Probably
the
second highest growth rate in the world last year after China. So it would be inconceivable. But I think there's a broader theme, which is that during a decade in which the United States was consumed since 9/11, with fighting wars in Iraq, fighting wars in Afghanistan, Latin American countries have matured economically, have had growth rates throughout South America, which are more than double the growth rate of the United States, and that's a
recovering
gap,
quickly from the global financial crisis.
That is a gap that has only accelerated with the U.S. financial crisis. In contrast to previous financial crises that began in the United States, Latin America was largely shielded from that. It was the last in, first out. It was able to adopt countercyclical policies. And during this time I don't want to really say U.S. neglect. I don't think that's the right term. But during a time where U.S. priorities were elsewhere, Latin American countries across the board were diversifying their foreign relations, not only in political terms, but in trade terms. China is now the largest trading partner, not only of Brazil, but also Chile and Peru. It's the second largest trading partner of countries like Argentina. And so there's a sense that the region that used to be considered, the Western Hemisphere, part of the U.S. sphere of influence, now has vastly expanded its global insertion and the number of global partners. And this is a reality that I think the administration, frankly, has to pay attention to. And the trip is a recognition, I think, of that fact.
So unprecedented democratization in the course of a generation. When you think back of these countries during the Cold War, and I know that's something you're working on in your doctoral thesis.
Yes, not only in terms of political stability, but also economic stability and growth. And I think after these 10 years, after this decade of almost neglect or looking elsewhere, Obama now, the United States deals with a different region. The region is different, and I think that calls into question the framework. If the framework to deal with the Latin American agenda, if it is proper to deal with these very different countries, and the asymmetry, for example, between Brazil and its neighbors has grown in the past decade. Brazil is larger today than it was 10 years ago, and Brazil now began the past several years dealing with other emerging powers outside its own region. So I think there could be a tension that Brazil would like to be treated not as part of a broader Latin American agenda by the United States, but as part of an emerging powers agenda. The BRICS. Obama went to India last year and declared his support, endorsed India's bid for a permanent seat in the Security Council, the United Nations Security Council. I think Brazil will look into that. Certainly there will be comparisons if Obama will do the same when he goes to Brazil. So I think that the framework of the U.S. relations with Latin America in general, South America in particular, even Brazil more properly, will be called into question. And I think there will be some tensions because there are a lot of themes, there are a lot of issues that are important for Central American countries that already have free trade deals with the United States, that have the drug trafficking problems. They're not as important, or there are other issues there to deal with Brazil in terms of multilateral trade negotiations, climate change, nuclear proliferation.
Could each of you provide us some framework for how we should think about expectations from the perspective of the three countries being visited and from the perspective of the country we sit in? Paulo, you made the point that the symbolism looms large in this encounter with Brazil, but also expectations. When people hear the list of issues that João just described, a state visit does create expectations as well. That's inescapable.
I think it has to create one, still in the symbolism, it will create in Brazil a very important expectation that the President Obama will be very well received, because he is the first African American president of the United States, and he will be visiting the largest country of African heritage outside of Africa. I think President Obama is the only international leader that polls above 50% in Brazil. People have an admiration for him, so the reception could add a very important ingredient in the relationship as diplomats from both countries look at it.
And then what expectation does that build? If we're going to get along better, what will emerge from that? Are there policy breakthroughs we can look forward to?
Well, I would say that the principal obstacles to announcing any grand initiatives are basically domestic. I mean, as Paulo mentioned, you know, the question of agricultural subsidies, not only for corn-based ethanol, but for a whole range of agricultural products that are subsidized in the United States, and therefore, you know, there are restricted, you know, imports from a variety of countries, Brazil and many others. The ability to move on that at a time of recession in the U.S. economy, I think, is very limited. Similarly, in El Salvador, I think there will be the most exaggerated expectations of what concretely will come out of this trip, whether it will serve as a platform for announcing a commitment to immigration reform, to extending temporary protected status, to expanding not only the security cooperation, but supporting the social agenda that the government of President Mauricio Funes has made a central platform. So I think that there will probably be a great deal of disappointment. The symbolism is very important. The fact that the president is going to Latin America, where he is enormously popular, is very significant. But the principal obstacles to moving ahead on a variety of different fronts, I think, are in this country and are not. The cards are not held in the White House.
Along those lines, when the president travels to China, for example, there's concern that he doesn't insult our great creditors. What are the landmines for Obama on this trip? What does he have to be careful about in Brazil or in any of these countries? First,
he has to remind himself that Brazil is also a creditor. Brazil, I think, is the fourth or fifth largest creditor of the United States. A lot of the reserves, $300 billion of reserves, is investing in treasuries right now. I think with Brazil, the danger to me is to raise expectations too much. The relationship is very complex.
With Brazil in particular?
Yes, because it happened under Bush and Lula. There was talk about a strategic relationship. We could move towards a strategic relationship. I think there are enough common interests to do that, but we have to start building this. And the relationship will become a strategic one. But I think both the style of President Dilma and the difficulties that President Obama has here come in handy this time, because they will prevent those soaring speeches about strategic relationship, etc. So, positive relationship based on real interest and doing things that has meaning to the two societies, to the two people, to the business community on both sides.
If you could highlight an issue or two that you would put at the top of the list as having the most potential for cooperation, significant cooperation, what would you identify?
First one, energy. Brazil is not only the most efficient producer of biofuels, renewable energy. Brazil is now, will become a major producer of oil. Here is an issue that the United States has to decide about. Would Americans prefer to continue to depend heavily on Middle Eastern oil, or would it rather change a little bit towards a country like Brazil that is a Western democracy that shares values with the United States? On this department of values, I find it fascinating, the choice of countries. The three countries were once governed by dictatorships or strong regimes that were supported in the context of a Cold War by the United States. Those three countries shows to the United States that democracy works.
So the opposition within those countries at that time was anti-American.
Yes, but finally what happened is that in Brazil, in Chile, in El Salvador, people in power now are people that value democracy, and they were not supported by the United States in the context of the Cold War. So I think there is a very interesting message for Americans to look at the president's trip in the context. The United States is looking for its footing in this crisis in the Middle East, in Northern Africa. I think those countries tell a very positive story for the United States. Really trust your own values when you deal with us.
If I could mention, I think in Chile, the question of energy is also going to be front and center, and alternative energies. Chile is one country that has no domestic resources. It imports oil, it imports natural gas. It's increasingly exploring the nuclear option, but there's tremendous interest in renewables and in questions of innovation. And there's a real emphasis, I think, on education policy. That's another commonality with Obama. But you asked earlier, what is a potential pitfall? And I think one of the real areas of tension in a country like El Salvador is going to be the sense that the United States is not doing enough to curb its own demand for drugs and its own sale of weapons that are then exported illegally to cartels and to organized crime groups in the region, and that is a central aspect of the violence that is being played out, in the region. That the United States, if President Obama has said in the case of Mexico, Secretary Clinton has said in the case of Mexico, that these are areas of shared responsibility where this problem wouldn't exist except for the U.S. role. The question really is concretely, what is the United States prepared to do to address those problems? And I think that is a potential area where there will be some friction.
Well, I think the fact that the United States and Brazil are facing fiscal difficulties at home, that tends to deflate a little bit expectations towards concrete measures in both countries in terms of even subsidies, agricultural subsidies, or trade deals that are not on the table, not being discussed at the moment, even arms deals. You may remember that last year Brazil and the United States signed a defense treaty that may pave the way for future businesses between both countries' arms industries in the future. But since both countries are facing these enormous difficulties at home, I think that alone tends to deflate a little bit the expectations. But a landmine to avoid in this trip, Obama's trip, is mentioning China. I think China is a concern not only of the United States, as we know, but also in Brazil. There's growing concern of the Chinese threat in terms of Brazil. China is now Brazil's main trading partner, but it's basically a north-south relationship, meaning that Brazil exports basic goods to China and imports manufactured goods. Brazil has a surplus of $5 billion with China, but still there's growing pressure inside Brazil to deal with China, to more protectionism. So, what I've read recently is that the lobbies here in the United States, they're also anti-China, want to deal with China, want maybe to join forces with Brazil, and if it would be possible for these two countries, Brazil and the United States, to put more pressure on China in terms of exchange rate policies, trade policies, and I think that will be a landmine to avoid, because keep in mind that Dilma Rousseff, she'll travel to China next month. So the proximity of these two presidential trips will engender certainly comparisons. Comparisons of the rapport between Dilma and Obama, and between Dilma and Hu Jintao, for example. And that in Brazil, historically, traditionally, Brazil tends to seek a middle ground between superpowers. And I think it will do the same between now its two major trade partners that are the United States and China.
Not a bad place to be a bridge between the two countries.
And it's why I agree with João, because this issue is particularly challenging in this visit, because Brazil and U.S. interests, as far as dealing with an undervalued Chinese currency, they're pretty convergent. Actually, Brazil also does not like very much the quantitative easing policy, because it complicates monetary policy in Brazil. But it is interesting to notice that the cheap manufactured products that enters the Brazilian market, the Latin American markets, and the American markets from China, they are also displacing Brazilian products. So here is a very interesting, important issue. Now, Brazil, I think, will be very reserved about dealing with that with the United States. That is an issue to be dealt at the G20,
Yes.
where Brazil now sits.
Usually controversial issues between Brazil and the United States tend to be discussed in multilateral forums like at WTO or the G20 group at the WTO, and that, or even the FTAA, the Free Trade Area, the America's negotiations that occurred in the late 1990s. Bilaterally, the two countries tend to avoid these thorny issues.
We're down to our final minute or so. Cindy, I want to ask you a quick question about trends that we should be aware of looking forward, not just in terms of relations between the United States and the region and these three countries that the president will visit, but also just within the region itself, how it's evolving. What are the trends that we should be looking at? Are there demographic things happening we should be aware of? What are the big things that we should look at?
Sure. Well, demographically, I think a big change is that the population, as in the United States, is becoming older. Whereas
It's the same
it used
dynamic?
to be, it is a very similar dynamic. The long-term trends, I think, are interesting because it's such a sharp contrast with the United States. I think there's a convergence, a growing convergence between center-left, center-right in the region over a set of common principles, over the importance of macroeconomic stability, respect for laws of the market, over a commitment to democracy, and also, I think, a commitment to the role of an efficient, effective state in providing for social welfare. So at a time where the United States is just being sort of broken loose by the sort of very agonizing debates over the role of government, there has been, by contrast, a convergence in the region towards sort of a centrist embrace of essentially a progressive, social democratic, dynamic private sector model, and I think that that's something to watch. There are, of course, important exceptions. There are countries such as Venezuela, to a lesser extent Bolivia and Ecuador, Nicaragua, in which the principles of liberal democracy are not, the guiding forces of government. But I think throughout the region there is that increasing moderation and a commitment to shared principles, which is completely opposite the dynamic of the United States.
Great, thank you. Well, and if the government shuts down, we may have to come back and do this again. But we'll return next week, one way or another, with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.